Hello, Buzzkillers. You've always wanted to be a patron of the arts, haven't you? Well, now you can. Become a patron of Professor Buzzkill by clicking on the Patreon link at professorbuzzkill.com. There are many levels of monthly pledges starting at only $1. And here's what you'll get in return. A warm feeling inside, the thanks of a grateful professor, shout-outs on the blog and podcast, coffee cups and t-shirts, and much, much more. But the most important thing is knowing that you'll be helping bring enlightenment to humanity. Thanks, Buzzkillers. Now here comes that music.
Professor Buzzkill Mini Myths.
Hello, Buzzkillers. It's your favorite professor here. St. Patrick is the reason for the season, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The myths and misconceptions around the great man, around the holiday, and around many things Irish in general. The first thing you should know about St. Patrick in the myth-busting realm is that he really wasn't Irish. What do you mean by that, Professor? Well, the first thing is St. Patrick was born when he was just born Patrick. He wasn't born a saint. That didn't happen that way. He was born in what's now England. He was a Roman Briton. He was born on the island of Britain when it was under Roman control. Now, it's not clear, scholars differ, about over whether Patrick was himself a Briton, a native Celt, right, one of the Celtic tribes, or whether he was from a Roman family, a provincial governing family that had come over to govern the British Isles. But he was certainly not born on the island of Ireland. Now, this is where it gets complicated, Buzzkillers, or at least it gets confusing based on what people like to think about the past. The important thing here is that St. Patrick wasn't British. He wasn't English. He wasn't Irish. He may have been Roman, but we'll hold aside that technicality for a minute. Back in those days in ancient history, people didn't have these kind of self-identities of being British, of being English, of being Irish. They almost certainly were much more connected and probably self-identified themselves, if you will, with whatever local group they lived in. Okay? They didn't walk around, singing "God Save the Queen" or celebrating St. Patrick's Day in the middle of March. Those kind of national identities are very, very modern, very, very modern, certainly since the 18th century. So we can't really say that Patrick was Irish. We can't really say that he was British. He was certainly from the British Isles, what became known as the British Isles. The second big myth, really, is that Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. Well, he didn't. This is what happened. Patrick, as a young man, he was a sheep herder. He was captured by a group of Irish slave raiders and brought to Ireland and lived with them for a while, sort of in captivity as a slave, and then escaped. He went back to Britain, became religious, went through holy orders and all that sort of thing, became a priest and a preacher, and went back to Ireland after having a dream that the Irish came to him and said, "Please come and walk with us once more," and presumably teach and preach and all those other things. So he goes back to Ireland, right, and does his work. Now, back to this thing about bringing Christianity to Ireland. There had been Christian missionaries before Patrick, the most important of whom was known as Palladius. He was a bishop. He was sent by the Pope in 431, AD 431, to Ireland to bring the blessings of the church to the Irish who were believing in Christ. That's a quote from his directive from the Pope. The Irish believing in Christ, which implies that there were a number of Irish people who already were Christians, and Palladius was being sent to reinforce that. At any rate, there were some scholars in the mid-20th century who argued that Patrick could have been actually Palladius, or maybe a combination of Palladius and Palladius' son, who had done also a lot of conversions, because the records are so scanty on all these people. But most modern scholars, most contemporary scholars have discounted that because there's enough evidence about Patrick, especially stuff in the Roman archives, that leads us to believe that he was a, if you will, certainly second and maybe third saint sent to Ireland to convert the natives to Christianity. One thing Patrick didn't do Okay, he certainly was eventually a bishop and certainly was a missionary. One thing he didn't do was banish snakes from the Emerald Isle. Sorry, it's too good to be true. The idea is that the original myth is that he stood on a hillside and banished the snakes from Ireland as a kind of symbol of driving out the devil. Well, no. Snakes never made it to Ireland. By the time snakes had evolved on the European mainland, the oceans around the island of Ireland had cut it off from the rest of Europe. So snakes could have never slithered across from Wales to Ireland the way they slithered across from the Low Countries to Britain. Okay? St. Patrick, no such thing. The snakes were never there. Well, Professor, at least it's got to be true that everything's green. There's green everywhere when you see St. Patrick's Day celebrations and things about Ireland. Well, unfortunately, killers, it's pretty clear now to most scholars that the Irish color, the color that represented Ireland, and certainly the color that represented the High Kings of Ireland, and then later the British king in Ireland, was blue. In fact, still, knights who are given the Order of St. Patrick are given on their shield, it's actually a blue in color. So blue is the royal color for Ireland. Blue was originally St. Patrick's color. Green came about in the late 19th century, like so many of these things did, because Irish nationalist groups and other groups were trying to find something more distinctive. Blue was a very common color. The British used it for other royal things. The French obviously used it. So they wanted something to stand out from other nationalists in the 19th century, and they chose green. And that's why the lovely Chicago River is dyed that way every year. And that brings me to the United States. As almost everyone in Ireland knows, almost all St. Patrick's Day celebrations really are American inventions. I want to have a big shout out to my friend Mark Burke in Dublin, who was a college mate of mine back at University College Cork in the early 80s. When I was a student and you went to St. Patrick's Day parades in Ireland, it was no big deal. In fact, it was a very, very small deal. The year I was in Cork, we went to the St. Patrick's Day Parade, which was only held by the Cork City Fathers because Tip O'Neill was visiting from Boston. Okay? And even then, it was a pretty rinky-dink affair. I got to meet the great man, but there was no great procession of bands. There was no great procession of colors, and there were certainly no rivers of beer and all that sort of stuff. All of those things mostly have their origins in 19th century Irish American traditions. A lot of these were wrapped up in the efforts in those decades to organize labor unions, right, to protest against other kinds of discrimination, right? So the whole politics, if you will, of working class culture, of Irish American culture in the 19th century, not just Irish identity, but other things like union organizing, those things help create a sense of Irish pride, a sense of pride in being Irish American and wanting to show that on St. Patrick's Day. So St. Patrick's Day, if anything, folks, the way it's celebrated is an American invention and has been re-exported back to Ireland and to other places in the world. Now in Dublin, there's a big St. Patrick's Day parade. Now it's a big, colorful affair. It wasn't always that way. And that brings me to an interesting point. Like I said in the beginning, I used to be a real jerk about this. I used to complain that, American celebrations of St. Patrick's Day are inauthentic and they're not Irish and all this sort of stuff. Well, the older I get, the more I say, live and let live. So what if it's mostly American invention? So what if it celebrates Irish American pride rather than Irish pride? Aren't there a lot more problems in the world to be dealing with than whether these things are historically pinpoint accurate? As St. Stephen of Stills used to say, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. Take that sentiment out on St. Patrick's Day with you, Buzzkillers. Over and out.
This is Aunt Ginger from Professor Buzzkill, and you're listening to the Epicast Network.
Epicast.